Welcome to Midlife Matters. I'm Marie, and each week I'm joined by my friends Julie and Mindy to talk about all the topics keeping women in the middle years up at night. Today we're talking about receiving words of affirmation. Anyone else struggle to take a compliment? We're also talking about finding joy in the midst of sadness. Two unrelated topics, but each one requires some work on our part. Join us as we share ways we're trying to get better at both. Let's get started. Listeners, today we're talking about receiving affirmation and finding joy in sadness. And we were just talking about this amongst the three of us, that these are both weighty topics, but we're really looking forward to getting into them. And as a springboard for today's discussion, we're using the book that we're using once a month, which is called What If It's Wonderful by NIcole Zasowski. And this book is about learning to release your fears, choose joy, and find the courage to celebrate in the midst of fear and disappointment. NIcole encourages us to ask ourselves, what if it's wonderful? And as always, listeners, you do not need to be reading along in order to enjoy this episode. We're just using the material from chapters 9 and 10 to think about and make changes in our lives. So, Julie and Mindy, receiving affirmation was the first chapter for this month that we're going to discuss, and I immediately thought of the 5 love languages. Did that come to your mind also?
Well, I didn't think about that.
No, I didn't.
Oh,
I
you
didn't
didn't?
think about that.
Well, maybe the reason I immediately thought about it was because one of my love languages is words of affirmation. And so I immediately thought of that. And so I looked up just a brief description of what the love languages says about words of affirmation. And it says that people whose primary love language is words of affirmation value when their significant other expresses love via written and spoken words. So I was thinking from the perspective of someone whose love language is words of affirmation, this chapter was even more weighty than not. But since that didn't come to your mind, what did you think about when you read this chapter? Like, just what were your initial thoughts?
Well, Maria, I just have a question real quick. Does that also mean that you receive compliments easily? Like if it's not from Steve, like just in public, or like do you find yourself?
I try to, because I've heard and read before that you should learn to take a compliment. Like,
okay, yeah, but I just meant I was kind of linking it to your love language if that just came easy. So maybe not.
Right.
So does it come easy?
What doesn't come easy?
To receive compliments.
Oh, well, later we talk about the different ways that people respond to receiving compliments. And so I think that I respond more strongly in one area, but I do really try to take a compliment. Just because that's been one of the things that I've read before, that it's almost like insulting the person that complimented you when you won't take the compliment.
True. Well, I tested Bryce, like without telling him what I was doing. I complimented him the other day and I was like eagle-eyeing him, like watching to see what he would do. He's like, oh, thank you. And he moved on. I was like, oh, he's got it. And then, but the other thing, and he never knew I was testing him, but the other thing that I thought about was, you guys have heard me talk about our birthday celebrations. One of the gifts we give to the birthday person in the family is a gift of words. And I immediately thought about that because I don't know who had the genius idea years ago to start doing that. Like when we would take the kid out, or Bryce or I, to their birthday dinner, we would order food. And then while we're waiting for the food to come, we each go around the table and we tell what we really love about the person, how we've seen them grow, what God's doing in their life, things that we just think are really cool about that person. And each person gives a gift of words. And so that's what I thought about, and
that's
how
beautiful
that has been. It's become one of our favorite gifts to receive on our birthday.
Yeah.
I went on a women's retreat years ago, and they did something similar. Like they went around the room and presented each woman there with a card, and they had a few words written on it that they thought that came to mind when they thought of you. And they said that they had taken each woman's name, prayed over it as a group that the leaders had, and come up with this. And it was kind of awkward to hear all that named in public, but let me tell you, I kept that card on my bathroom mirror. I think it's still there.
Oh,
it's got water spots all over it, because it is. But it was really meaningful.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Well, another little interesting fact about words of affirmation people, because I was just reading that a little bit last night, it said that people that value words of affirmation, like their love language is that, they have a very high BS meter. So they'll know if you're not giving a sincere compliment. So I thought that was interesting because I do feel like I can sense sincerity, or whether it's just a throw off, like, oh, I'm trying to flatter you. Like I can tell if it's flattery or sincerity.
Yes. Just don't say it if you're not genuine.
Right. But one thing that I was thinking about was that, and we've talked about this before, at least I know that Julia and I have, and I don't know about you, Mindy, but like I can work for words. So like we've had this podcast for 4 years. We don't even attempt to make any money off it. But you know what our payment is? Words of affirmation. Yes, like when we get an email or when we get a message, or if I talk to someone and they say, oh, I loved what you guys talked about, I can make 5 more episodes off of that.
Yeah,
you know
definitely. I get that. Yeah, it's so encouraging. You're like, wow, and it doesn't have to be, just one person is all it takes.
Right.
Right. So anyways, this chapter really spoke to me. Like I felt like I could really identify. But Julie, why don't you summarize where we are in the book and like how she got to this chapter? Like what's she talking about here?
Okay, this chapter starts off with she's just received an email that's given her some bad news about, I think, a job offer that she was hoping to get. Mm-hmm. And so that's the very first thing that you find out. And then that weekend, they are going over to a friend's house, and her husband has planned a 30th birthday celebration for her. And they're going to be gathered at a friend's house with all their closest friends. And he is including a time where every person at the party can give words of affirmation to her, kind of as their gift to her. And she said that she did receive them as a gift, but she also struggled to receive them, like how she should respond. And, she really had to be intentional about maintaining eye contact and receiving each compliment without condition or objection or question. Just kind of soak it in. And she said for the most part she did, but then afterwards she was like, is that really acceptable to just soak in that affirmation? Is that not being self-indulgent? She questioned that afterwards. So that's kind of where we are to start talking about that.
Right. And one of her discussion questions is, what are some messages about our identity that can be barriers to celebration? And so what did you guys think about what prevents you from celebrating? And I think she means like celebrating yourself, kind of, like receiving those compliments.
Yeah, one that I identified with is kind of like an unresolved dream or an unaccomplished goal, like, oh, don't celebrate yet, I'm not there. Like, and I'm not talking about anything big. It could even just be like my watercolor art. I would be like, like I'm not really where I want to be. Like, hold off your compliments until I get better. Or like, oh, she used some of these phrases. You caught me on a good day, or you should see the ones I throw away. Like you always have to add that condition instead of just thanks.
Yeah.
Or I do anyway.
Yeah. Probably something every woman can identify with is when someone compliments her cooking. Almost every woman immediately points out something wrong with it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How it could be a little bit better.
Right. Because it's easy for us. She wrote this and I wrote it down too, because I'm like, that's so true. But it's easier to believe stories about our failures and weaknesses than it is sometimes to believe the things that are good, because sometimes that's what we're focusing on. You're always focusing on how to fix something. So you can't fix it if there's nothing wrong. And there always seems to be something wrong, both with, whatever you made for dinner or however you decorated, or, just anything that you put your hands to. We're not perfect people. We're going to have failures. And sometimes it's just easier to look at that and then asking yourself, well, am I really worthy of celebrating? Because I'm not perfect.
Not wanting to be a fraud comes to mind. Like, I kind of feel like, okay, they're saying all these great things, but I know that it's not perfect. I know that I messed up here,
Right.
Or I just got lucky lucky this time.
Right. If they
Right,
knew,
right.
they'd know what a fraud I am and they wouldn't be doing all this.
You don't see the whole picture. You know,
Right.
let me tell you the whole picture.
Yeah. I definitely related to that quote from the book that you used, Julie, where she said, it's difficult to tolerate celebration of ourselves in the present with unresolved dreams and unaccomplished goals. Pride tells us celebration is a reflection of our accomplishments. And so I think that we only want to accept praise or compliments when we think we've done a good job, or like we're like, yeah, I deserve it. And really, some of the most meaningful ones are the ones when we don't deserve it, but they see beyond those mistakes that we made.
Yeah, more for who you are, not what you've done.
Right.
The person you are.
Well, another discussion question is, your feelings about your value will always feel like it's true for someone else, but not for you. No doubt our feelings about our experiences are real, but feelings aren't always true. Thankfully. What are some sources of truth in our lives, and how are each significant? I think we need to just constantly remember and reiterate that you can have a feeling and it feels very real, but that doesn't mean that it's true.
Yes, and that's hard.
So where are we looking for the truth?
Yeah, she said there's 3 sources of truth. And obviously, God is the author of all truth. And we can find all kinds of affirmation in Scripture of how God delights in us and how he's given us promises. And but I like that she points out, but he also gives us the choice about whether or not we take him at his word.
Right.
Have a part to play in that,
Right.
And I think the other 2 sources are ourselves and people. And I don't think that's to be confused with that we're a source of capital T truth. But we can what's the word? Speak truth, that comes from God.
Right.
A big source of truth about ourselves is other people. Like, we all have family and friends and coworkers and church members, and who can see our gifts and name them and call them out and recognize them and appreciate them. And so I think God does use those people to speak truth into our lives, and then it's just up to us whether we continue to speak that versus speaking lies about ourselves.
Well, I just had a situation this morning where I'm so thankful for my husband, and that he can see the big picture, not carry my emotions, but he can see me without knowing what my emotions are. So this morning I was telling him, oh, I wish I was good at that. I'm like, you and Abby are so good at this. He was like, are you kidding me? You're so good at that. You're amazing. And again, it was just, I was like, huh? It was not something that I saw in myself. And I appreciated that it was kind of a little shaking me and saying, you don't feel it, but you got it. And I didn't feel it at all. And I needed him to say it.
Could you see what they were saying once they pointed out the examples of where you have been good at it?
Okay, well, I'm going to try to believe you. But again, I have to choose to believe that is accurate. I just right now, I was focusing on how I felt like it was wrong, how I didn't do it well. So anyways, it's nice to have those people in your life sometimes, if we're willing and honest to say, hey, I just feel like I messed up or I didn't do well. And they can say, you know what? It's okay. You're actually really great at that.
Right. And think about when we praise other people, our family members, our kids, our friends, we know they didn't do it perfectly, but we have so much, we have so much more grace for them,
It's true, Marie. It is easier to have grace sometimes for others than yourself.
Right.
Yeah, I thought about how when you compliment a kid, one of your kids, and they're like, oh, Mom, you're a mom, you have to say that. You're my mom, you have to say that.
It drives me crazy.
Because they don't believe it about themselves. And you're trying to speak that truth into them, and maybe they don't believe it about themselves because, of pride, I don't deserve it, or they feel like that's too self-indulgent to hear that,
Right.
If we say, I can't accept that compliment because I'm not perfect, that's really prideful, because that's saying that I'm only worth celebrating if I'm perfect, if I've earned it. deserved it. But if we feel like accepting affirmation is too self-indulgent, then that's kind of resorting to shame. Like, I don't know, it's almost like you're trying to choose the better option, because that seems like the better option because it seems less boastful and less self-focused.
Mm-hmm.
Like to just, I think that's why we do that. We dismiss those compliments. We offer some kind of condition or objection because we don't want to seem prideful.
Mm-hmm.
But her point is really neither one is better than the other because they're still both self-focused.
Mm-hmm.
One seems like it's more than the other, but she said they're really equally self-focused.
Yeah, like you asked me earlier, what would make it difficult to accept a compliment or words of affirmation? And she had kind of given us the choice in the book. What makes it difficult, either pride or shame? And I think that pride makes it difficult because it says that pride tells us celebration is a reflection of our accomplishments. So if you're affirming something about me that I know I didn't quite do right, or I haven't really gotten there yet, pride won't let me accept that because I know I haven't accomplished it yet. It's not so much the shame, whereas, it's not that I feel like it's self-indulgent to accept a compliment, because I think that we all need to be able to do that. But it's like, well, I only deserve one when I've actually finished it perfectly. But you're right, that pride still leaves you only focusing on yourself. She's saying both are bad. Not accepting it out of pride and not accepting it out of shame are equally bad. It's not like the shameful person can say, oh, well, I'm so humble and that's why I don't. No, that's wrong too.
Right. It looks like maybe the more humble thing. I think that's maybe someone's goal in kind of self-depreciating. It's like, oh, I'm, I want to appear humble, but it's really not.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes when you're trying to correct one, it can lead to the other. You're trying to fix one, so you jump the gamut, you go the complete opposite direction, and either way, like there is somewhere in the middle. That they're both detrimental healthy living.
Yeah, and reading this chapter, our goal really is somewhere in the middle. If only we could live there and really learn what that felt like. Do either of you guys feel like most of the time you exist kind of in the middle?
Oh, Marie, that's awful to ask.
Oh, is it?
How good are you at staying in between pride and shame? It's going to take some time to think about. Okay. I don't know how good I am about that, Marie.
Okay.
Well, like you said at the beginning, Marie, don't you think this is very easy to recognize in someone else? Like when you compliment someone and they go, oh, like they just won't take it.
Right.
It's like you just want to scream and say, just say thank you, but then you find yourself doing the very same thing. So I know how that sounds. So like you said, I have made it a point to just try to say thank you and stop, not add any other words to that. Just accept it.
Right. Okay. So sounds like all three of us are struggling.
We're on the struggle bus.
But we are trying. Like we have the principles down, and so sometimes we make ourselves do them, We know what we should do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I guess this kind of leads into like the next question. I guess this would be the middle. What would it look like to begin to celebrate who you are apart from your failures and your triumphs? What would that look like? What would it look like to live in the middle? I put that you could celebrate good and joy without waiting for perfect. You could celebrate progress and not necessarily a finished accomplishment. Those are two big things that would be, recognizable if I could do that.
Yeah, definitely progress and growth is something to celebrate, that you don't have to wait until the end, to perfection, because you're probably never going to get there. And she said to just start by noticing how you respond to compliments, and stop yourself.
Right.
And I loved this. She said, don't wait until you feel this truth. You have to act on it. Feelings follow actions, not the other way around. Like it may not feel good to do that or natural, but since when are we supposed to live by our feelings, Act on the truth.
We get to choose what narrative we believe and choose what narrative we remember about ourselves, about other people, about situations, and even just about yesterday. And so I think it's courageous to be able to look at a situation and point out and maybe even write down in your journal the growth and the progress, because it's noticing those. I mean, this all goes hand in hand is just remembering those steps, those incremental steps, and celebrating that and kind of patting yourself on the back even, in a way it's a surrender almost of, yeah, I know I'm not perfect, but I praise the Lord that I was able to do this. And that I was able to give him this situation, and I watched him work it out for good, because naturally, or my natural inclination would have been different. So I want to celebrate that I did not go with my natural inclination or the first thing that jumped into my mind. You know what I mean? And so even writing it down so that you can see that there is growth.
Right.
Yeah. I like something that she said in back on the pride shame thing. She says pride celebrates who we are apart from Christ. In other words, the celebration is all dependent on what we've accomplished. But shame refuses to celebrate what Christ has done on our behalf. And that would be like who he made you to be and the gifts he's given you and the talents. But true humility celebrates who we are in Christ. So it's who we are in all our weaknesses and failures, but then what he's done for us and what he's given us. So it is that balance in the middle.
Thank you for reading that. That was like I underlined and starred that section, Julie.
We tend to focus on how broken we are. And that's true and necessary to really grasp the gospel, like how good the gospel is, like we really need it. But she pointed out that wasn't our starting place. When God created everything, he said, this is good. And when he created us, he said, this is very good. So like we started out God's beloved, like we are his image bearers. And I think she just wants us to remember that.
How could receiving affirmation, how could seeing the value in ourselves help us to celebrate others? That's also something that she talked about. I know that I feel like I have like a couple strikes against me. So Enneagram 1, which we've talked about before, where you're really hard on yourself. It's like the perfectionist. It's like you have to do it all right. And you're really hard on yourself. And then also it's the words of affirmation thing. Like that's my primary love language. But anyways, I think that people that are hard on themselves tend to be hard on others. Like if there's a certain area where I'm hard on myself, I'll be hard on other people too. And I don't know how to stop that. Like I recognize that's a problem a lot of times after the fact, but in the moment it's like, well, I'm just trying to get them to be their best self, or I'm just trying to help them, or I know they could do it better. Like I'm, in quotes, encouraging. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Don't you want to be better? I will help you know how to do that.
So anyways, I think that if I could live more in the middle and not being so hard on myself, I wouldn't be so hard on other people.
That is very self-aware of you. And I appreciate that. I don't struggle with that, but I live with someone who does.
Okay.
And so it's funny because my first inclination is build the person up first. You build. And then if they ask, then you tell them, if they want to improve something. Okay, I might tell you, but I'm avoiding conflict. I really have to read this quote that she gives us in the book because it goes right along with this. She quotes Timothy Keller's book in The Freedom. It's called, The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. And Timothy Keller is actually quoting another Bible teacher that we all love, C.S. Lewis. And the quote is this: "The thing we would remember from meeting a truly gospel humble person is how much they seem to be totally interested in us. Because the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less." I love that quote. It's wordy and you really kind of have to pick it apart and kind of sit with it for a minute. But I think that when we're fully feeling loved and filled by the love of God, and surrendering, laying our hands open, all of our faults, all of our sin, all of our shame, all of our pride. And you lay that down and you take on his person and you feel fully loved and secure in his love. It allows you to love other people really well. Because I think it's easy to be critical, if you don't feel fully loved. I actually think that it's hard for people. You can't give out of nothing. And so it tells me a lot about who you are when you can celebrate someone else so genuinely, so freely, so open, and you're not giving anything of yourself. Like, it's just who you are, and it's Christ in you. It's not something that we have of ourselves.
That's a good quote. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that quote because I think it's easy to think, oh, I don't want to be prideful, which is thinking too highly of yourself. It's like what you think about yourself. So I'll think less. I'll think lower of myself. But humility is more about like how much you think of yourself. Like you should think less of yourself. And then when you're not thinking of yourself, you have that freedom to focus outward on other people.
Right.
So I think it's about how much space in your mind is filled up with thinking about yourself. You don't have room to think about other people.
Right.
So getting our eyes off ourselves and getting healthy in this area can help us also love the ones around us better. So I definitely thought this was a good chapter, very valuable, a lot to think about for sure.
Yes.
Things to remind ourselves of. The next chapter that we had to read was about finding joy in sadness. And this was not as comfortable of a chapter for me to read. And it wasn't even like the first one was comfortable, but this one was just hard for me. So I'm going to rely on Julie and Mindy to kind of give some direction to this. But Julie, why don't you go ahead and talk about where we are in this chapter?
All right. So where we start off in this chapter is the author has a 3-year-old son, and then the day before this takes place, she has had a miscarriage. So she's with her son, and she said, before her first son was born and she had miscarriages, that was a different kind of grief where she just worried, would any pregnancy ever come to term? Would she ever have a child? And now that she has her 3-year-old, she said the grief has changed, because now she knows what she lost. She realizes with the 3-year-old and how much she loves him and who he's becoming. Now her loss seems even greater. It starts off, they're going to have a family movie night. It's Friday night, and this is what they do. And they watch the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out. And I was just going to give a little summary in case you haven't seen the movie. It's an animated movie, and Inside Out is set in the mind of an 11-year-old girl named Riley, whose feelings and behaviors are determined by the interplay of 5 characters that represent her emotions. So there's joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust. So each one of these has a persona and even a color. Like I think sadness is blue, and they kind of look like their emotion. And all the emotions work with and struggle against each other for control. And she said she's always noticed that joy seems to be like the alpha dog, like always wanting to control the others and push sadness aside and tell sadness, hey, you belong over here. Don't get out of this circle. Always trying to control sadness.
Yeah, I liked that movie. I thought it was fun when we went to see it. There is kind of a war between the emotions and like which one is going to win out.
Yeah.
So how have you guys experienced the interplay between pain and joy? And Julie, I just feel like this whole chapter is just like ready-made for your life. For 2 years, Julie's husband has had pancreatic cancer, and every day is a war between pain and sorrow and joy. And I mean, just tell listeners about that, Julie.
Yeah, I was going to say I've lived this every day, like in the shadow of cancer, uncertainty, sorrow, and then a birthday will come up and we celebrate it. Or it's Christmas and we celebrate it. Or my husband says, I'm going to have another baby and we celebrate it. There is joy in the middle of sorrow. I've found that it's not like you have to choose one or the other because they can happen in the same moment. And there's little joys, like just a great conversation with a friend, or you witnessed a beautiful sunset. Like you start to notice more things that are joyful.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what she wants to point out in this chapter is that to be joyful isn't always looking for a silver lining, like where I'm going to have to choose one over the other.
Right.
Like a really hard phrase when people say is like, oh, well, everything happens for a reason. That's just not very helpful. Like to invalidate all your sad feelings. Like, no, you should be looking on the bright side. Like those sad feelings have a purpose,
Right.
And I don't think joy has to deny sadness. And that's something you'll learn when we talk about the end of the movie, Inside Out. Joy coexist alongside sorrow. And you have to choose joy because it's not a feeling. It's more about it's a way of thinking about things based on truth, the truth that And so, yeah, this chapter was very fitting.
Yeah. Her, when she started the chapter, I was so there with her because the time that I remember it going hand in hand so well was exactly what she described. She'd experienced a miscarriage and she's grieving while she's holding her 3-year-old and still needing to be mom, still needing to pour love in the 3-year-old and do nap time and read books and play house and do dinner and and it's just that 3-year-old has no idea how broken you are inside. You have this complete love for your child that's living and you're grieving a child that has passed. And I've been there and it's really hard, you just, because you have to keep living. You're forced to keep putting one foot in front of the other because you have to be present for those that still need you while grieving the things that you're broken about. And so her picture of that with her son was just so relatable.
One thing I really related well with her was when she said, she kept going back to this relationship between joy and sadness, like just how to make sense of it, how they coexist. And she said, I know God didn't orchestrate my suffering. I know he doesn't cause it, but in his goodness to us, the pain is not wasted, that good things can come out of it. And I think Romans 8:28, if you're familiar with that, kind of gets misinterpreted or misused when people say all things work together for good. Things don't work together for good. It's in all things God works for good for those who love him. And I think that God can use our pain, it's never wasted, and that he can use it to work things in us and through us. Beautiful things can come out of us or through us, through our pain. And I like what she said. She said, heartache has introduced me to hope. Growth has sprouted from my grief. And I feel grateful for the ways in which pain has introduced me to more of God than I knew before. And I would totally agree with that I know God in a deeper way and more than I ever have before. And as much as I don't want this life, I also wouldn't have that without this pain.
Right.
So, it's just a weird feeling because you still don't want it, but then you think, well, wow, look what I do have,
Right.
And I probably wouldn't have gotten it any other way.
Going back to how she started the chapter, this was something that became more personal when I did have miscarriages. I already talked about, just in the living with the grief, having joy within the sadness. But it was something that years later that I realized that I could relate with God in a way as a parent, that he lost his son and that he knew what it felt like. And so for me, that was comforting. Again, introducing me to more of God through my pain, knowing that he's a savior that can relate, that can feel that. And there is a verse that has always meant a lot to me. It's Hebrews 12:2. And it's talking about Jesus. And it says, we look to Jesus. He's the founder and perfecter of our faith. who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And the reason that means so much to me, because it's talking about his death, but it says that it's for the joy that he chose to die. And then we are going to transition our conversation here, but right here in this verse, and it says, but he didn't stay dead, because right now he's seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So he overcame that. And for me to see joy in that verse has always been very, very meaningful and eye-opening to me.
One of the questions she asked was, how can sadness and joy hold a memory together? How can sadness help us find joy?
Before we get into it, let me just explain the end of the movie, what prompted this question. So in the movie, these emotions are all struggling to be on top, to be the main one, and joy tends to always want to push sadness aside. But then the little girl in the movie and her parents, they moved to San Francisco, and joy struggles to maintain control of all the other emotions because the little girl is sad. She's missing her old home and her friends and her life. The little girl is recalling memories of her life that she's left behind and that she really misses. And sadness was all over that moment, the character sadness, coloring the entire core memory blue. Joy is watching this unfold in dismay, wishing that she could just rescue the memory by ridding it of the sadness altogether. But before she can insert her sunshine, she watches Riley's parents find her and connect with her and comfort her with a hug in the midst of her sorrow. So instead of shoving sadness aside, as she was accustomed to doing, joy quietly shares the memory with sadness, not one after the other, but together at the same time. In that sadness, her parents drew close to her and hugged her. And that was a good thing. She didn't want to take that away. And I thought that is just a perfect picture because when you get a really bad terminal diagnosis like pancreatic cancer, your priorities get all rearranged, how you spend your time, but your conversations deepen, your expectations are different, your relationships are much deeper, your family gets closer, people say more meaningful things than they ever would have felt comfortable saying before. And people draw near and God draws near, and you just start to know more of God than you ever knew before, if that's what you're clinging to. And it's like your face muscles are getting stronger. Muscles don't grow with ease, they grow with resistance. And so you're just able to see all the joy that's there in the middle of something really terrible. But I loved that picture of just how they need to both be there,
Right.
Not just to kick the sadness aside, because it can be transformed into something good. And it made me think about something that she did not use this word, but the word bittersweet. I just have always loved that word. And I was wallpapering this weekend and I had a book on tape going, and it was a psychologist, and she was talking about emotions, and she used that word bittersweet. And she said, it's when you feel both sadness and joy at the very same time, it's a mixed emotion. And she said, actually, little kids can't do that. You have to be 10 or 12 before you can really feel a mixed emotion like that. And she said things that evoke bittersweetness might be things like watching your kids grow up, and when they reach milestones, you're proud of them and you're happy for that next stage, but then you that's the end of a certain era, a time, and that you're going to miss things about that time. Or letting go of a friendship, or coming home from vacation. Even you can feel bittersweet, you're missing that wonderful time and those memories, but you're glad to be home. I don't know. I think it's the feeling that makes us want to listen to a sad song, or I don't know, enjoy a rainy day. It's just I don't know, I've just always kind of appreciated bittersweet moments. And you're sad about letting something go, but you're happy or filled with gratitude about having had the experience.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I've had a hard time with this chapter. I don't know. To me, it's like, well, why doesn't God just fix it? I don't want to have to feel joy. I don't want to look for joy in pain. But when you said bittersweet, I think about how many times I've described parenting as bittersweet. And that is so true. Like, I guess I can understand bittersweet better than I can understand find joy in the pain. And I think that bittersweet happens to us all the time. Even if you move from an area you loved, you can be excited about where you're going, but it's bittersweet to leave behind. Like, we experience that all the time. That word just makes something click for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always liked that word. And I think it's the joy that you're feeling over something good happening kind of transforms the pain and gives it meaning. Like they say, grief just reflects how much you've loved. Like you wouldn't be grieving something if you didn't love it.
True.
So they kind of have to exist together. And I liked the example in the book she gave, and she said Jesus used this example. And I didn't go check it to read in scripture, but he gave the example of childbirth, like the pain of childbirth. But then when you're holding your baby, all transformed to joy. And I thought that's a really great picture, like of joy, of pain transformed to joy.
Yeah, I feel like even this fall, like when everybody left, and I've dreaded the empty nest for so long, like thinking that it was just going to be, but I feel like bittersweet has so much described that stage. Like I wouldn't want them to stay exactly where they were. I want to see them grow and thrive. Like, I don't know. There's just so many examples in life where we experience that. Mindy, I know you've experienced it many times with all your moves.
I have, and with kids going to college, and just the other day letting Grant go back to Kansas again. Wouldn't change a thing, but I had to take a moment to grieve, and and now I can celebrate what he's doing. But I miss him. I can't just go see him very easy, and so.
Yeah.
But I also wouldn't change a thing. So it really is that back and forth. But I wondered if I would share this or not. But there's one picture, one example of this that is so vivid in my memory. And it's sad and it's beautiful. And I'm going to go ahead and share it. But we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of losing a very, very good friend of ours. And it was a sudden loss. We were not expecting to lose Brian. And we grieved. In that grief, the next Sunday that his wife, Stephanie, came to church, she sat with us. And we were used to seeing her and Brian together at church. And she came to sit with us. And the first worship song that came on, that started playing, she lifted her hands. And I just lost it. Like in that moment, I just kind of watched her because she had just suddenly had to bury her husband. And here she is in church lifting her hands. And I thought, how does she do that? And at the same time, it's like when I looked at her and I saw her hands lifted, she had no control. She didn't know that was going to happen. And she just was laying it all at God's feet. And at the same time, I could almost, across the veil, the death that is this veil, into eternity and into heaven, I knew that Brian's hands were lifted in praise of Jesus at the same moment. And that picture in my mind was so vivid that she and her husband, both, though separated by death, were raising their hands in praise and worship and surrender. Though she is grieving, like fully grieving. And so to me, I've never experienced that, but I think about Stephanie and I think about the loss of our friend. And to me, that's the picture of joy and grief.
That's amazing.
That's a powerful picture.
This reminds me of a song, and it's one of those melancholy, bittersweet songs, but it's always been one of my favorites. And it's not very popular. It's a song by Amy Grant called "So Glad." Have you ever heard of it? It's probably 40
maybe if
years
I
old.
heard it, I might.
I mean, it's really old.
Too,
I listened in high school.
Okay.
And I just pulled up the lyrics because it's just great because it uses this phrase called happy sad. And I thought that goes right along with our bittersweet.
Mm-hmm.
But the lyrics are, I had laid some mighty plans, thought I held them in my hands. Then my world began to crumble all away. I tried to build it back again. I couldn't bear to see it end, how it hurt to know you wanted it in that way. And I'm so glad to find the reason that I'm happy sad. And you've torn it all away. And I'm so glad. Long before my plans were made, I know a master plan was laid with a power that superseded my control. And if that truth could pierce my heart, I wouldn't wander from the start, trying desperately to make it on my own. And it goes back into, I'm so glad that I'm happy sad.
I'm going to look up that song after we're done recording.
It's got a real 80s vibe to it.
Okay. Yeah.
Very dated, but
it's got
the
good lyrics.
are just amazing. Yeah.
Oh, well, these chapters, you guys, there's a lot there. Listeners, if you're reading along with us, then you know how weighty these 2 chapters were. And if you aren't reading along with us, you can still hear and relate to, these are like universal human emotions. So definitely, we're so glad that you tuned in. And Julie and Mindy, I'm glad to talk about these with you. Listeners, if you have anything you want to get in touch with us about, you can find us on Instagram at Midlife Matters Podcast, or you can email us at midlifematterspodcast@gmail.com. But before we go, we want to do I'm a Fan. And Mindy, what are you a fan of this week?
Fan of a worship song. It's newer to me, though I'm not sure when it came out. If you've watched The Chosen, I know Marie talked about The Chosen not that long ago. It was on their like Christmas episode or whatever, but I've been hearing it more on the radio, and I finally like put it on my Spotify playlist. Oh, it's just my favorite. It's called Gratitude, and it's by Brandon Lake. And if you look it up on Spotify, there are like a lot of different versions of it. You know, you can get like the short radio version, get the long version. So it's just such a beautiful song. And it really is just the only thing we have to give the Lord is ourselves. And so it's not talking about accomplishing anything or doing anything or any type of works, but really just kind of, it's a surrender of yourself. And it also reminds me to just be thankful and have gratitude for what God has done for me, the gift of the Savior.
Yeah. Sounds like another good song I need to look up.
Add that one to my playlist.
Okay.
Oh, it's so good.
All right, Julie, what are you a fan of this week?
Well, I think I'm going to be a fan of something else I got for Christmas. They're called airtags. Are you familiar with those?
I've heard of them. People using them with luggage.
Yeah, well, I am using them for my keys.
Okay.
It's just a little round thing about the size of a quarter, a little thicker, and you can buy little key fobs to put them in. I guess you could just drop it in a suitcase or drop it in a backpack, but these are on a key ring. And I put them on my keys, and I put one in my backpack, and I'm trying to get them for other people in my family that keep losing things.
That keep asking you where things are.
Yeah. So you can, and then it links to your phone, and then if it'll show you how many feet within your reach it is, you know, like it's 5 feet away, 10 feet away. And then if you put it in lost mode, it'll start beeping so you can go to it. Because at first I thought, if this is only showing me that my keys are in my house, that's not going to do me any good. I need
to
GPS me to it.
Yeah.
Well, I know that keeping track of your keys has been a long running struggle for you, Julie. So I'm hoping this will be the key.
And apparently my son inherited that.
Okay.
Oh, no. I've always teased Bryce that he has an Apple Watch just to find his phone.
That's good. All right. Well, I am a fan of a romantic comedy that I watched before Christmas, and I forgot to share it on Midlife Matters. But it is called Something from Tiffany's, and it's on Amazon Prime. It's put out by Amazon. Have either of you guys watched it?
No.
Okay.
I'm excited to hear.
Yes. So I watched this with my daughters, and we all loved it. So the basis is called A Woman Gets Upended When an Engagement Ring that was for someone else leads her to the person she's meant to be with. So basically, 2 men are in Tiffany's. One buys an engagement ring. One buys like a bracelet. And the girlfriend that was going to get the bracelet ends up with the engagement ring. And the one that was supposed to get the engagement ring ends up with a bracelet. And I mean, it's just cute. It's got great scenery. The actors and actresses are good. I don't know. I just really enjoyed it. Mindy, you would be all over this movie because it has so many Hallmark vibes.
I'm writing it.
I was going to say, it sounds very Hallmarky.
But it's not, and forgive me, Mindy, but it's not as cheesy as a Hallmark movie. So I thought it was good.
Okay, good.
Yeah, if you just want something that feels good.
Yeah.
You said it's on Amazon?
Yes, it's on Amazon, and it's called Something from Tiffany's.
Yay, I've got my movie for tonight.
Yes, yes. And it has a bit of a Christmas vibe. So you'll, watching it this time of year is still good. But yeah, I can't believe I forgot to mention that. It was a good one.
Yeah. Sounds cute.
Yeah, yeah. And it'll cheer you up from these 2 chapters.
Yes. Oh.
All right, Julie, Mindy, look forward to talking with you next week.
Sounds great.
All right. Bye. We're so happy you joined us today. You can find the show notes for this episode at midlifematterspodcast.com. Also, please tell a friend about the show and help them hit the free subscribe button on their favorite podcast app. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Midlife Matters Podcast. That's where we post pictures and stories about all the things we talk about in each episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.